Hey guys, and welcome to another limited review video for Oath of the Gatewatch here on the Neat Zone Magic channel. Today I'll be talking about what I think are the top 10 rares and mythics in Oath of the Gatewatch. The criteria for this list are that there are the cards, the rares and the mythics that I would take over all the uncommons and commons in the set, in pack 1 at least, and they are the rares and mythics that are so powerful that they can completely alter the game in your favor if they resolve. Sometimes they need to stick a little longer than just resolving, but some of them actually just need to resolve, and they can be pretty game-breaking. So we'll go ahead and get into the list. And we start with World Breaker at number 10. He's a 7-mana 5/7 with Reach, which is pretty expensive, but when he enters the battlefield, you can exile an artifact, enchantment, or land. There are very few artifacts in the format that people are going to have a lot of, although, hitting someone's head-drawn archive isn't going to be too upsetting for you, as long as they're tapped out and can't sack it to draw cards anyway. But hitting a land is not bad. I mean, 3 colors happens a lot in this format, and you can take them off their splash color, and there are plenty of good enchantments in the format. So the fact that he sort of takes something out every time he's cast, which, by the way, even if he's countered, he gets to do that, if that ends up being relevant, is pretty good, and he's also got a very reasonable body that can block for a very long time. But what I think makes him especially good is the fact that even if your opponent somehow finds a way to deal with him, you can sacrifice a land and return World Breaker from your graveyard to your hand. I realize this means you have to have a lot of lands, but as a late-game card, this is exactly the kind of thing you want. It's got a huge body. It at least is going to take out one card, and then if your opponent's probably going to have to remove it somehow, and even if they do, as long as it's not exiled, you can return World Breaker from your graveyard to your hand, and you can cast it again and hit something else. So it's a very good card that'll sort of win by attrition over time. Like, if you and your opponent are both in top deck mode and you have a World Breaker in your graveyard, you're feeling pretty good about it. And like I said, in general, he's got a pretty massive body, can block basically everything, and also attacks fairly effectively as well. So at number 9, I have Inbringer, who costs 5 and a colorless for a 5/5. And he untaps during each other player's untap step. It says each other players because Two-Headed Giant is sort of a sub-theme. And then in some drafts, some pre-releases even, will be Two-Headed Giant. And Inbringer's even better in those cases, obviously. But even with just 2 people in your typical Magic match, Inbringer is very good. It has the ping ability, which everybody loves. I mean, it can take out creatures. It can slowly kill your opponent. And it gets to do it twice, assuming you're not attacking with it. And you're happier, honestly, if you're attacking with it most of the time. It also can make creatures unable to attack or block, and it can even draw you cards. So, I mean, the draw a card is pretty wastes mana intensive. But you at least have to have 1 mana to use its to cast it in the first place, although you can sacrifice a Scion, meaning you lost your colorless source. But even if you do that, you end up with a 5/5 pinger who untaps during each other players and tap step. So pseudo vigilance, and it has a bunch of abilities attached to it that makes it even better. So even if it's just pinging someone every turn, it's great. But if you can lock down an opponent's creature every turn or draw a card on your opponent's turn every turn, then that's pretty good as well. It's the kind of card that I would definitely first pick. Wastes mana. I mean, the specific kind of colorless mana doesn't seem like it's going to be that hard to come by. Not only are there waste lands inserted into the packs, there's also several serviceable sources of colorless mana. In addition to the Eldrazi signs we're already used to, there are tons of common lands in the set that produce colorless and do other things, and common and uncommon. And there are some common creatures who produce colorless that are perfectly good and serviceable as well. So I don't think getting colorless to play this is going to be a problem. I mean, if you first pick it, you do want to prioritize a little more cards that help you produce colorless mana, but I don't think you have to have it for this card to be very good. All right, next we have, so far we're 3 for 3 on Eldrazi, we have Reality Smasher, who's a 5-mana 5/5 and costs 1 colorless, and he's got Trample and he's got Haste. Those are 2 very good words when you're, curving out with this guy on turn 5. And on top of that, if it becomes the target of a spell or ability, or just spell, an opponent controls, that spell gets countered unless its controller discards a card. So what's great about this card is he's massive, he's amazing, you are always happy to play a 5-mana 5/5 with Trample and Haste. And on top of that, though, if your opponent finds a way to deal with it, if they have to use a removal spell to take it out, they end up 2-for-1ing themselves, basically, because they have to discard a card. I realize that if your opponent, let's say, has one card in their hand that's a removal spell, or they hold onto a land to use this, then that's, not quite as good. But the fact that, it may make your opponent slow down from casting removal for a turn, and the fact that it's already, the fail case for it is just that it's a 5-mana, 5/5 with trample and haste. That's a pretty amazing fail case. And I mean, ideally, you don't want him to die anyway. But the fact is, he does make your opponent jump through a few hoops to die. Your opponent has to have another card in their hand, and it has to be a land or something for them not to lose anything. Because even if they have no cards in their hand, the spell they play gets countered. So it's a pretty good card. So I think it's definitely a big bomb I would take over almost anything. Doesn't really commit you anywhere, even in a world where it has to be cast with the fancy new kind of colorless mana. Well, not new kind, but the colorless mana that, it can't just be mana of any color the way the 4 can. It has to be specifically colorless mana. But I don't think it'll be hard to come by, as I mentioned earlier. So now we're on to yet another Eldrazi. So we're 4 for 4 for 4 on Eldrazi being in the top 10 list so far. Maybe it'll be a list of all Eldrazi. I mean, it's just kidding. It's not, but there are a lot of them on the bottom of it, certainly. And here we have a 3-mana 3/3. And then on top of that, it has an incredible ability. This one's not quite as like a massive, amazing, like WoW card as the other ones I mentioned, but it does have an amazing ability. It lets you exile another target creature and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Now, this allows you to do a lot of things. You can protect your creatures from removal, so your opponent basically has to target the displacer if they want to kill it. You can reactivate your creatures that have enter the battlefield abilities by exiling them and returning them to the battlefield. You can make that ability trigger, by doing that. Say it puts Eldrazi Scions into play, whatever. And additionally, you can also sort of just use it as a way to tap down your opponent's creatures so you can either attack through them or keep them from attacking. I mean, basically both, because you can do it, at the end of your opponent's turn, at the beginning of their combat step, and then one of their creatures is tapped. The downside about the card is it does require one of those colorless manas, and chances are it won't be too hard to have one or two of these in play most of the time. But you're not going to be able to use this over and over again when you get to the late game most of the time. If you end up in a really sweet colorless deck, it's possible, but it's not going to happen real frequently, I don't think. But I do think it's a very strong card that can really be abused. And it doesn't really have to be abused to be good, because you can just use it to lock your opponent's creatures down or to save your creatures. But I would prioritize creatures with enters the battlefield abilities a little more, like the creatures that do support things and things like that, if you have an Eldrazi Displacer. All right, on to number 6, and we have our first not Eldrazi. It's a 7-mana 5/5, Sphinx of the Final Word. Can't be countered, so you can't deal with it that way. It has flying and it has hexproof, so it can't be killed by anything other than sacrifice effects. Of which, I'm trying to think, of which there are very few. There is a rare that they just printed that can make you sacrifice this if it's your only creature. And that's about it. There's also planar outbursts that can deal with this, but that's very few cards. They're both rares that I'm thinking of. But additionally, I mean, the third line doesn't really matter for limited very frequently, but it could. Your instant and sorcery spells can't be countered by spells or abilities. This is the kind of card that for constructed will be a fun win condition for control decks in the control mirror, because not only once you resolve this do you have a win condition, but on top of that, all of your counter spells will never be countered by your opponent's counter spells. But, I'm not talking about constructed here, but that's sort of what they were going for flavor-wise with this card, is a control mirror card. But in limited, it's still an incredibly hard to deal with card that can kill your opponent in 4 turns, assuming they are at 20. Other flyers can block it, but there are very few flyers in the format that can block and survive a block of Sphinx of the Final Word. So it's just a card that can easily win you the game. Big creatures with hexproof are always good and limited, and this one isn't any different. Next, we're back onto an Eldrazi. We have Deep Fathom Skulker, a 6-mana 4/4, which, isn't great, but then it has the Biden of Thassa ability. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. So this is a great card in that you can play it and it immediately does something for you, assuming you can swing into your opponent. And, most of the time I feel like on turn 6, unless you're already you're like way behind in the game, you're probably going to be able to swing with a couple things. And they'll all help you draw cards. On top of that, it has a way to make those creatures unblockable to make sure you do draw cards. And that does cost 3 and the special wastes mana, colorless mana. And so you're not always going to have that available to you, but this card's good, and even in a deck with 0 colorless sources, I would say. In a deck with with more of them, it's even better, of course. But the fact that it's, gives you a respectable body, and on top of that, just can net you a massive amount of card advantage, forces your opponent to play different. If they were just sort of racing with you, all of a sudden they're like, man, I can't really race this guy, when it means, maybe I am hitting him for 5 a turn and he's hitting me for 3 a turn, but he's drawing 2 cards every time he does it. So that becomes a big problem for your opponent. So I think this is a very good card. Again, like all of them on the list, one I would first pick over all of the uncommons and rares in the format. Next we have Chandra Flamecaller. That's not an Eldrazi. It's a Planeswalker. These basically always make the list because Planeswalkers are crazy and limited. And the 2 they printed here, I mean, spoiler alert, I guess, but one of them, both of the ones they printed are on this list, and you've only seen one of them here at Chandra Flamecaller. The 2 they printed here are both very good. Chandra Flamecaller, 6 mana, comes into play with 4 loyalty, and it has, interestingly, it has an ability that costs 0 and draws you cards. The last Planeswalker that had that was deemed too good, and granted, Chandra's 0 draws you cards ability is a little more balanced, but no matter what, it can draw you cards. Even if you have 0 cards in your hand, you get to draw 1 card for 0 loyalty. You don't have to give anything up. The +1 ability is also very strong. It's something your opponent then suddenly has to deal with. Is the fact that you can just spit out 6 damage with haste onto the battlefield every turn if you want to. And the ultimate is pretty good as well. I mean, there are going to definitely, I feel like, going to be situations where you play this on turn 6 and you're like behind and you have no choice but to blow up the battlefield and do 4 to everything. That's not bad either. Ideally, you do want her to last a couple of turns, maybe draw you some cards, do some damage to your opponent. But she is very strong. I would first pick her over everything. Like all Mythics and like all Planeswalkers, she'll also be worth a good amount of money, which also incentivizes taking her early. All right, on to number 3, which is where we have Linvala the Preserver, a 6-mana 5/5 flyer, which, you're usually happy to play. They're usually not mythic or rare, maybe sometimes rare, but what makes Linvala so good is that a lot of these bombs, even if you're really far behind against your opponent, even if you manage to get your bomb in play, it's not going to get you back ahead so effectively. Linvala makes sure to take care of that. If you're behind on life, she gains you 5 life, helping you in the race. If you're behind on board, she gives you another 3 power in the air on top of her 5 to help you win the race. So she's the kind of bomb that sort of makes sure that, unless you're incredibly far behind, like at 3, your opponent's at 20, and has 8 creatures in play and you have nothing, I mean, Linvala is not really going to help you there. But if, your opponent's ahead of you, even if you're at like 6 or 7 life and your opponent's, still in the teens, and they have like 5 creatures in play, playing Linvala suddenly becomes a problem. You suddenly go way up in life. You suddenly have 2 creatures who, if they have to, can block effectively, but can also threaten to do 8 damage in the air every turn. So that's why I like Linvala a lot, the fact that she makes sure that, if you're behind, now you're much less likely to be behind, at least. And, if you're ahead and you play a 6-mana 5/5, you're not too sad either, with flying, I should say. You're not too sad either because that's going to kill your opponent for you eventually while your other creatures help, or, your other spells and so forth. So Linvala, very good. Good enough to be number 3. At number 2, I have Kozilek the Great Distortion, and this card's probably a little iffier than the other ones I have on the list, but it is, in a vacuum of all of these cards, I would say the most powerful of them, just as Ulamog was in Battle for Zendikar, and I think Ulamog may have also occupied the number 2 spot on my top 10 Rares and Mythic list there. And Kozilek is so good that if you get him in your first pack, you should take him and basically try your hardest to build a deck that can cast him, which isn't that hard if going into pack 1 that you want to do that. There's tons of ways to generate Eldrazi Scions. There's ramp. There's all kinds of things you can do. And once you take Kozilek in your first pack, there's no reason not to try to build that deck. It also means other cards that, like this colorless mana, which we've seen a lot of on this list actually, are also going to be better in your deck because you're going to have tons of sources of it to make sure you can cast your Kozilek. Kozilek's just crazy good. It's a 10-mana 12/12 with Menace. And when you play him, what I should say is when you cast him, so even if he gets countered, you get to draw a number of cards equal to the difference in your hand. Let's word this better. I mean, you can read it there, but if you draw cards until you have 7 cards in your hand every time Kozilek is cast, And then on top of that, to sort of synergize with that, he's not indestructible like Ulamog, sadly, but on top of that, he can protect himself decently effectively because he just loaded your hand with cards, and then he has the ability to discard a card with converted mana cost X, counter target spell with converted mana cost X. So, even if he gets blown up immediately, he probably just drew you a fistful of cards, made your opponent use up a card to kill it, and you may even be able to counter it. I do think Ulamog is better than Kozilek, but he's only in Battle for Zendikar. But Kozilek is sort of in the same family, both, flavor-wise and card-wise. So I think he's a card that if I saw in Pack 1 at least, and probably later too because he'll be worth something, but definitely in Pack 1 I would be wanting to take Kozilek and trying to build a deck around him because he's just that powerful. And then at number 1, which I guess if you were listening to my brief spoiler earlier, you know what it is, I have Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. 3-mana planeswalkers are almost always strong. Just look at the Lilianas of the world. And Nissa's no exception. She may not be as strong as Liliana, but a key for planeswalkers is that they have the ability to protect themselves. Chandra, which we looked at, can't really do that. She can sort of. She can nuke the board with her minus ability and make sure that she still has enough loyalty to survive. And that's not bad. That's actually quite good. But Nissa's much cheaper at half the mana cost, comes into play with 3 loyalty, and can put plant creatures in play to protect her. On top of that, once you build a plant army, she can put a +1/+1 counter on all of them, and all of your other creatures as well for -2. And then if you get to her ultimate, you get to gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of lands you control. So, a lot of the time you're just not going to have the time to get to her ultimate, but the fact that you can cast her in turn 3 and you can just start building plant armies, and if your opponent's not attacking into Nissa to try to slow you down, you're eventually just going to run them over with your creatures, and your plants will be helping with that because they'll get larger with +1/+1 counters, and if you get to her ultimate, as is the case with most planeswalkers, you basically just win the game. So that's my list of what I think the top 10 rares and mythics are. Again, that's a list of cards, all of which I would take in Pack 1 of Oath of the Gatewatch over all the commons and uncommons in the set. Gets a little more complicated if you end up with 2 of them, let's say, and one of them's foil. But I think I would take Nissa over all of them, and for the most part this list would agree with that if there were both in some of these packs, I would obviously take cards higher up on the list than lower on the list as, the tiebreaker. So that's my list of the top 10 rares and mythics in Oath of the Gatewatch. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know if you think I left something out. Let me know if you think I'm overrating a card. Those kinds of discussions help all of us think more about the limited format, and I certainly appreciate them. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.